Thanks, Rob. Normally when people say their views have evolved, it's not considered a positive thing, but not in this town anyway. But I'd like to thank IER, Rob and Bob, for having me over, having me down from British Canada. I was in BC and flew overnight, so if I'm a little sniffly, it's because I was in a giant flying can with 300 people and all of their various scents and germs and the like. I'll try not to infect anyone. I want to thank Rob also for conveying on me a doctorate in economics. I didn't have one before. He misspoke. Actually, my doctorate's in environmental science and engineering, but I've been doing environmental policy analysis for about 20 years now. So I'm going to give I'm not using PowerPoint, as you see. Power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so I will just speak from my notes. But first, a bit of background. I started working on, and by the way, also this will be a jargon-free presentation, which is because I'm not an economist. So it should be a little easier on the eye and ear, hopefully. So I started working on climate policy in 1997 in California at the Reason Foundation. One of my colleagues is here in the audience, Ron Bailey, former colleagues, and moved to Canada for a while, where I worked at the Fraser Institute in British Columbia on the same issues, and then 7 years inside the belly of the beast here at the American Enterprise Institute. Now I'm back in Canada, in Calgary, for the Fraser Institute, where I was greeted by one of the biggest floods in Alberta's history a couple weeks ago. While I was in the States, at that time I was watching as the U.S. was edging toward very bad climate policy. They were looking at cap and trade, they were looking at regulations, and the consensus at the time when I was at AEI was that some sort of national climate policy was going to get through. And what would be better than the disaster that was looming of cap and trade, which seemed to have legs to make it through. So a lot of studies suggested cap and trade regulation would be bad. Some of my colleagues and I decided to take a look at this. Steve Hayward, Kevin Hassett, and I in 2007 wrote a piece called Climate Change Caps versus Taxes, exploring what an ideal carbon tax would look like and comparing that to cap and trade and regulation for the impacts. We modeled a $15 a ton carbon tax and found at the time that it would result in about an 11% decline in CO2 emissions, which is non-trivial, while raising non-coal-based energy forms only modestly. Coal-based energy prices, not surprisingly, would be affected more strongly, which is to be expected in any plan intended to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We found that if you rebate all the revenue toward the distortionary taxes, reducing distortionary taxes, that you could minimize the impacts of the tax and under some rare and extremely unlikely circumstance provide economic benefits. Now, we never actually said we thought a tax like was a good idea. We never said actually that we wanted to do it. We simply said, our exact words were, if you want to structure it thus, a carbon tax, well, what we said is if you want to structure it this way, it will do less harm than that way. What we actually said was, for these reasons, we conclude that if aggressive actions are to be taken to control greenhouse gas emissions, carbon-centered tax reform, not greenhouse gas emission trading, is the superior policy option. The way I always thought of that was, I'd rather be slapped on the hand than slapped on the face than punched in the nose. I'd rather not be any of those things, but I can certainly say one is better than the other, or less bad than the other. But still, carbon tax supporters thought that meant I was in their camp, and I got invited to all sorts of roundtables, and got to be on the radio a lot, and got to be on the television a lot, got yelled at by certain members here in the audience, from the other side, from the free market perspective a lot. And everybody thought, Ken's the carbon guy now, we've got him, he's on our side. So, but a funny thing happened, as they say, on the way to the forum. I noticed that none of the people who wanted me on their panels or their shows or whatever who supported a carbon tax supported anything like the ideal carbon tax. Not a single one wanted true revenue neutrality. Not a single one wanted the tax actually calibrated to conservative predictions of future harms. Not a one, and I'll talk more about this later, ever suggested they would trade a single regulation away for a carbon tax. Instead, what I found is that they didn't want carbon taxes instead of, they wanted carbon taxes and trading systems and regulations. And I finally decided that discussing an idealized carbon tax pretty much at all just plays into the hands of those who want to lay on this very non-idealized tax regime. So in 2011, I wrote that watching states loot their dedicated eco-taxes for general revenue, seeing the emergence of more proposals for revenue-raising carbon taxes and such, I have to admit that my friends in the free market movement were right. A carbon tax would simply become another general revenue tax and a step in carbon seduction. I think I coined that term, carbon seduction, which is, oh, come on, you've already accepted the tax. Now take a regulation and maybe a cap-and-trade scheme. It's always that first potato chip that gets you, right? So let's look at a little bit of carbon tax reality, starting from where carbon tax proponents are right on the carbon tax. Carbon taxes are better than cap and trade, which is better than regulations. You could spend days talking about why cap and trade is a horrible idea, and I did. And an ideal carbon tax would probably do only modest damage to the economy. That's where they get it right. Now where the carbon tax proponents get it wrong, this is sorry to say a much longer list. Well, first, as somebody mentioned earlier, carbon taxes are not strictly a tax on bads, that is, greenhouse gases. They're a tax on economic inputs because virtually everything we do in the economy requires the use of energy, and significant energy use generates greenhouse gases. So hence, even if you wanted to discuss it as a Pigouvian tax, it doesn't really work, or a tax on externalities, because it's actually also a tax on production. As Ross indicated, it's also untrue to say that we don't have carbon taxes already. We do. The US and Canada and much of Europe have dozens, in fact, of carbon taxes. They're just hidden in the form of vehicle fuel economy standards, appliance standards, renewable fuel mandates, building insulation standards, et cetera. These, pretty much all the conservation measures you can think of are hidden carbon taxes, because in the US and Canada as well, we have other regulations that govern other pollutants, right? Hazardous air pollutants are already regulated elsewhere. The only reason to lay on these kind of efficiency standards is to reduce energy use, not the pollutants necessarily that go with them. As I mentioned earlier, carbon taxes won't be in lieu of, they'll be on top of. And in fact, they'll be, I've never heard of it, like I said, offer to take away the vehicle fuel economy standards in exchange for a carbon tax. If you ever want to see the sincerity of them, just say, okay, can we kill the new Obama vehicle fuel economy standards? Because after all, I'm taxing the carbon. That's what you want me to do. You shouldn't really care. You should be indifferent to whether or not, right, I drive a truck or I drive a hybrid, as long as you've got the carbon tax. And not one will go that way. And imagine if they did, though, right? Imagine if they did. What do you think the automakers would say, having retooled their lines, if somebody came back and said, oh, well, we were only kidding with that. We have a carbon tax now, so, right, so we don't need the vehicle fuel economy standards, and you know, it's all going to be Ram 150s from here on. So all you guys who were spending all the money on small cars, well, too bad. And those efficient refrigerators that cost $600 extra, sorry, people can go buy them from China if they want to, as long as they pay the carbon tax on their electricity use. We don't care. So then there's the issue of carbon taxes being regressive, which they are. But you can fix the regressivity problem by taking money and giving extra money to the people who are poor. What I mean by regressive is that poor people spend a bigger share of their household income on energy than better off people. And it makes perfect sense, right? You live in an older, less insulated house. You drive an older, less fuel-efficient car. You drive longer to work because you can't afford to live where you work necessarily. You live in remote suburbs. And so you wind up spending much more on energy as a share of your household income. And you can fix that by taking the revenue and giving it back disproportionately to the people who are poor. The problem is when you do that, first of all, you increase the economic damage of the tax because you're not using it to reduce income taxes, since the poorer people have less income and pay lower taxes. But you're also taking away the signal, the very signal you want to create, which is for them to reduce their carbon emissions. If I make you whole again, you have a limited reason to go insulate your house or get a new car or whatever. So you've not only increased the damage of the scheme, you've cut the effectiveness of the scheme. But if you don't address the regressivity, you will never get the scheme in the first place. Carbon taxes are also geographically discriminatory. Some places have a lot of hydropower, right, particularly up in Canada. Some provinces have huge amounts of hydro potential. It's cheap and it's abundant and makes sense to use it. Others have lots of shale and oil and gas. And other places have lots of coal. And it's not as if you can simply change the nature of the fuels you have in your geographic region to reflect the national tax. And so you're going to have regional discrimination. Again, you can fix that by giving tax transfers from the blue states to the red states. How many people think that's going to happen? But again, even if you did, right, you're still making harming the economy more and undermining the actual practices you want, which is conservation and things like that. So the odds of a carbon tax being implemented in a real-world sense, according to the textbook models that you've seen that render them harmless and bring on reductions, is extremely slim and unlikely. And I've never seen one proposed in the U.S., at least outside of opinion columns. There are carbon taxes. If by some miracle you got one of those implemented, it wouldn't last long. There are two carbon taxes in Canada, one in Alberta, the province of Alberta, which is where I live these days, and one in British Columbia. Both of those taxes are relatively young. The British Columbia tax, I think, is 6 years old. The Alberta tax was first. The Alberta tax is a weird hybrid tax. It's not really a tax. It's actually an emission intensity reduction target, plus if you can't make that, you pay a fee to the government, and they invest it in research, and go round and round we go. The British Columbia tax, however, was close to the ideal tax, imposed at a low level, revenue neutral, used to reduce distortionary taxes, slow rate of growth. But it's interesting that after only 5 years old, when in the last election in British Columbia, the environmentalists wanted to decouple the tax from revenue neutrality and double it, hike it, right? And take a chunk of the money to invest in their favored research programs, like solar power and wind power and electric cars and the usual Solyndra litany. And in Alberta as well, the proposal now is they're saying that if Alberta doubles its carbon tax, that somehow that'll change President Obama's mind about Keystone, as if he cares what is done in Alberta. I assume he knows where it is, but maybe not a good assumption. But so an ideal carbon tax has a life expectancy of a couple of years before environmentalists say, well, that was nice, now let's decouple it, we'll take the revenue and let's increase the tax. And of course, we've seen that already playing out here in the U.S., as Ross discussed and Bob discussed. You've already seen a hike in what would be the carbon tax rate, which is the social cost of carbon. It was $22 a ton before. It went up recently raised from $22 a ton to $36 a ton, which if you had a tax in place that was calibrated to that, would have given you a 67% tax hike with the stroke of a pen from EPA. Finally, how much time do I have? 2 minutes, great. Governments are notorious for raiding dedicated funds. This is another reality, which is, well, it'll be revenue neutral, and how long it will stay that way. Governor Brown, environmentalist, right, recently raided California's dedicated green fund that raises money through the cap and trade system to the tune of $500 million, which he borrowed. He promises to pay it back, as other trust funds that have been looted have always been paid back, with interest, he says. But of course, environmentalists are pointing out that he's not going to be able to repay the time, right? So all of the time that they don't have the money to invest in their favorite schemes, they're not getting the emission reductions or technology investments they want. And so even though if he does borrow it and pays it back at interest, it represents essentially putting the program on hold for the sake of general revenues. And again, the final points would be that the unilateral imposition of such a tax would offer little to no climate benefit. Everybody understands that. Even if the United States were to practically shut down, Canada could close down entirely. But if the United States did shut down, it still would not be reflected in a significant alteration of the global temperature trends in the year 2100 or 2050. If everybody else in the world did go along, as my colleague Ben Zeiker at AEI has pointed out, we'd have an international climate cartel with tax rates set in Europe and imposed on democratic countries undemocratically, which would be considerably worse than the alternative. Such regimes are highly undemocratic. Finally, some conservatives are saying, well, we'll take the climate issue off the table. If we have a carbon tax, you have conservatives arguing, right, let's do a carbon tax and that solves the problem. But it won't solve the problem because efficient taxation of carbon emissions is not what environmentalists want. For one thing, it lets you decide to go ahead and emit, right? You can pay the tax. It is not, as Ross pointed out, a cap on emissions. It's a price on emissions. And environmentalists have said this overtly. They don't want a carbon tax. They'll take one as a seduction issue, but they don't want them. And what they really want is to force energy consumption down entirely because they believe that that's what enables humans to make an environmental footprint. And they see energy control as their best way to do that, and they're probably right. Also, environmentalists won't suddenly vote Republican because there's a carbon tax. The president won't suddenly accept the Keystone Pipeline because there's a carbon tax. You won't hear the environmental groups cheering for the development of Alberta's oil sands because you have a carbon tax, because after all, Alberta has a carbon tax. nothing will change in terms of the political dynamic if you have a carbon tax, right? And in fact, on day one of the post-carbon tax world, the environmentalists would say, this tax is, we have a new study, tax is 3 times too low. And if you don't go along with it, they're going to say, look, you're a denier. You're a science denier. Here's our study. It says it's too low, and it has to go up. And how many people have read the headline, new study shows climate worse than ever before? Right? Have you ever seen the other headline, climate change not as bad? No. So it's a one-way ratchet to a high tax. My conclusion is in the rarefied world of economics, where people like Kevin Hassett, my former colleague at AEI, and others, create elaborate schemes of taxation that are rebated in certain ways toward the most distortionary taxes and with high efficiencies gathered through things like a sales tax, because that's the least, it costs you the least extra money to raise $1 of tax and all that kind of thing. You can construct wonderful models in which a carbon tax is relatively benign. However, we don't live in that world. The world we live in is one where any carbon tax would soon be perverted to the basic desire of government, which is to secure new revenue streams that are hard for you to avoid, hard for you to actually measure or see in your bills you pay, and that can be diverted to whatever you say want to put them to, because there is no such thing as a government lockbox. Mr. Gore had that part right. What we need is a lockbox, but we don't have any. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take questions at the end of the session.